All right. I think it is recording. What? Zoom is recording. Zoom, zoom, zoom. Make my heart go boom, boom. You know, you sing that when you do Zoom. I do too. All right. So this is super cool. So we're going to try to do this instead. So that way you don't have to see this. Or as I was watching last week's lesson, my backside. So we don't have the board this week, but we do have a PowerPoint. And so I'm hoping that this Zoom is something that we can maybe start doing. We'll see how it works this week, and maybe next week I'll have some more of you join, and we can kind of have more of a dialogue back and forth. But this, we're going to give this a go. So each week it's been a different location and a different method. So thank you so much for bearing with me here. Dealing with the different technologies and stuff as I've been trying to wrestle how to faithfully present this material as well. I know that PowerPoint is been called boring by a certain Dwight Schrute, but he is not here, and this is probably the most effective way we can do this. So we're going to do it. We're going to try. There's our nice fancy little background, biblical church history. All right. So last week, if you remember, we were talking about we ended the first century. Okay, so that was right at about year 100. We went to about year 120 and talked about Ignatius and how he went to Rome and he was killed for his faith. We talked about Clement of Rome. We talked about some of these persecutions. What we're going to see here, let me see if I can move this box just a little bit so y'all can see. Hopefully in the recording I'll be out of the way a little bit more. Or how about further down here? Yeah, y'all don't need to see me. But we do need to see Emperor Trajan's name. He's important. Okay. So we're going to continue this week. We're going to mainly just talk about persecution during the second century, the rise of apologetics, and then some of the great teachers. Next week, this is so much happening in the second century. Next week, we will talk about heretical teachers, and then we will talk about the beginning of the canon. We will also talk about the Apostles' Creed, which finds its roots taking form here already in what is called the Rule of Faith, and that the Apostolic Fathers write concerning this. So, without further ado, let's get going because there's a lot of stuff to talk about, and this is going to be super exciting. So, persecution during the second century. Right now, persecution is still localized. So Nero, it was mainly in Rome, like we talked about last week. Domitian, another emperor, and their attitudes are kind of relaxed still. Emperor Trajan, his correspondence with a young governor is going to show that in about 110s AD, we're about 115, something like that. The attitude towards the church is, let's not waste our time hunting these people down. What we need to be doing is, concerned with some other things. But if you find a Christian, what would lead you to then is torturing them to where they repented, where they would recant. Sorry for that misuse. They would recant from the Christian faith. They would deny Christ, and then they would have to make a sacrifice to one of the pagan gods, and then they would be let free. They would be let go. And a lot of people did do this. And so you're going to see already, just make note in your notes of the people who do, recant. Their recanting is going to have big implications later. When the church finally does become accepted in society and Christianity is legalized and it's no longer persecuted, the church is all of a sudden going to have people trying to come back to the church who renounced Christ and renounce the church, and they're going to have to wrestle with, what do we do with these people, and how do we wrestle with that? And there's going to be a lot of thoughts on that. So just remember that they are going to have this coming up. I made just a couple notes of persecution here. Ignatius is killed in 115. Polycarp is killed in 155. We're going to talk about Polycarp in just a second. He's one of the disciples of John the Apostle. All right, and then Felicitas and her 7 sons will be killed in 165 alongside Justin Martyr, not like the exact same time, but they were killed in the same year. And so these are some of our well-known martyrs. We now know that they're not wasting this time, but they are seeking them out. Definitely just to hit on that story of Felicitas and her 7 sons. It's a really powerful testimony of her not recanting and saying that her sons won't either, that they know that Christ will protect them. And so she's one of our first more highlighted female believers, and so she's definitely a one that is just a powerhouse. Her 7 sons don't recant either, and they are all killed together, and that they do not deny Christ. And so her account is going to be captured by Perpetua. The martyrdom of these 2 ladies is going to be written in the beginning of the 3rd century. And Perpetua we will talk about in a couple of lessons from now. She is a studette. She is bold in her faith. We will definitely talk more about her. Her father is going to be begging her, not to do this to him. It's a powerful testimony. He doesn't want to lose her as a daughter. Says that it's just actions, it's just words, but she sees it as more than that. And so there's definitely going to be some really powerful testimonies here. But we'll talk about her later. I did switch these 2 persons' names up when I was being interviewed by Corey on Instagram. I remember that a couple weeks ago, got off, and I said Perpetua and not Felicitas. And so a good way to remember that is Perpetua was pregnant, pregnant Perpetua, versus Felicitas, and that was her and her 7 sons. So these are some of the more well-known martyrs, but this is still going to be localized, guys. We will not see empire-wide persecution until about 249 AD with Decius, when the Emperor Decius is on the throne. So they've still got a while. It's more sporadic. It just depends kind of on your different governors and how they see the threat and how concerned they are. One of the emperors coming up is going to be very concerned. Marcus Aurelius, many will know him from he was actually a Stoic philosopher. He has very famous writings and thoughts, and he will be one who definitely Felicitas and Justin Martyr will both be killed during Marcus Aurelius's reign. So what can we learn from the lives and deaths of these martyrs, and what does it benefit the church as we gain through this? I think it shows us that the church has always been, we're showing that this is not our home, that the world, the prince of the power of the air here is very much aware that the kingdom of God is on the move, and that we can see that he is ready to stop this, and the church is spreading because it's offending people and throwing off their powers of structure. It's throwing off their understanding of the world. Like, think of the pagan, thought process that's been happening, and all of a sudden this breaking through of this God who sent his son, Christ, and that you are sinful, that we have fallen, and we need salvation, we need grace. And so there's really big stuff that we're dealing with. And so we're going to kind of be dealing with a lot of things like that, but persecution's going on during this century, but it's not as widespread. All right, several people mentioned they wanted to see a map of the Mediterranean world. And so here it is, this nice little map that I found. Some of these main parts, remember we had talked about, last week. Okay, so several of the big places. Antioch, see right there, that's see if I can move my mouse. Boom. If this records it and shows my mouse, there's Antioch. So that's one of our main parts. Alexandria, again, remember, Alexandria's been settled. It's a very huge intellectual movement of the world. This is where Alexander the Great has founded this place. The Seleucid Empire is founds Antioch. Remember, these are the ones where they are definitely going to come, and they're the ones who destroy the temple. And so it's definitely a big place right there, but it becomes pretty much a center for the church as well in the 1st and 2nd century. Remember, Paul, his missionary trips are going through Antioch. He's traveling to Antioch. He spends a lot of time there. We think the Gospel of Matthew was written there. And so that's in modern day Syria. Ephesus, y'all know Ephesus. They have several doings there, a lot of mentions in Scripture. Another one, so this mouse where I'm pointing at is going to be the site of Constantinople, eventually coming that way. But right now, it's obviously not there. That's going to come about, 4th century. And so it's coming. That's going to be a huge deal. Athens, this is where the academy is, the philosophers. You have Rome up here, and then just kind of broad, you've got France. This is going to be Lyons. This is where Irenaeus is going to be bishop at. So we are going to talk about this in a little bit. That Lyons, modern day, is a city in modern day France. It's one of the bigger cities actually. And then here's Spain. But most of this is kind of more known as Gaul. This is where the heathens, if you want to call it, what the Romans call them, eventually are going to come, and they're going to invade and sack Rome. But there's just a little bit of the picture of the modern day empire. This is the extent of the Roman Empire. This is at its height of all the land that it controlled at that time, which is massive. All right, rise of apologists. So persecution, when it's happening and it's pretty heavy, we're not really, out there as much. You're not seeing these councils that you're going to see in 4th century AD, because we can't put hundreds of church leaders together in fear of arrest and violence, persecution, and trial and death. But we do see that there are pockets now of it's more localized. It's not as violent at this time. And so what happens is Christianity is going to begin to experience a rise of apologists. And so this is arguments in favor of, this is defense of Christian beliefs. And so with that being said, obviously apologetic works. This is people sharing their faith. This is learning to talk about this, understandings of how Christianity actually plays into different things. You can definitely see this in how Paul, is writing his mission trips. He is using apologetics to share his faith. One of the most famous ones is on Mars Hill, where he is using their own culture of the altar to the unknown God. That he's using that and saying he is known. There is this one, and let me tell you of him. I think that's kind of a example, at least for me, my understanding. The church, this is where the apologetics comes from. I'm going to scoot out of screen here 1 second and grab a notebook because I want to kind of talk a little bit about this. So the apologists are trying to answer different charges. As you can tell, my second little bullet point is not fun, nice things and things that Christianity does not allow. It is very much against a lot of these things. Atheism. Christians are being charged as atheists. They do not worship the pagan gods. Therefore, they are atheists. They are deniers of God. Orgy parties. This is them. The Christians used to talk about coming together, communion, as love feasts. And so obviously people began to mock and use crude language. And they said that there were orgy parties, incest. This is from the terminology of Christians would call each other brother and sister. And so obviously sometimes when people got married, they still called each other brother and sister in Christ. That's where that charge comes from. Cannibalism, again, that comes from the language of the Lord's Supper. That's where that charge comes from, is that they're eating people. They're eating someone. There's some really disturbing, different mocking pagan works against them. I don't really want to read them because it talks about basically what the church is being charged with, that they were, putting a child in a piece of bread, and that they would cut up the child and they would serve it. It's very gross stuff, but this book is good at capturing some of those charges, some of the answers. It is by Justo Gonzalez. It's pretty good. Again, I think I've quoted that before. Use that, and it's Southern. Novelty. This is a super interesting one. So for the pagans, one of the things that gave legitimacy to ideas, to religion, to different things, was the fact that it had its roots that were very, very, very old. And one of the charges was that Christianity was new. It was novel. We hadn't seen it before. I'm sure you've actually been hearing this word used actually currently with the COVID-19 situation that we have going. But anyway, what's happening here is that they're charging this. And one of my favorite things is, I forget which church writer kind of writes it, but they kind of fire back on the fact that, hey, you know, the Greeks have Homer and that he goes all these years ago. And he fires back, well, our writings come from that Christ is the completion of the prophets and the law, and Moses is older than Homer. So it got this kind of sarcastic response, but it's just awesome of that, you know, it's from the beginning of John's gospel stands of, in the beginning was the word. And so we're drawing all the way back. We're not novel. This isn't a new thing right off. That Christ is a completion of the law. He is the coming fulfillment of what we're talking about with the Jews. He is the Messiah. And so definitely the apologists are now separating a little bit that Judaism is kind of falling into, it's not as popular anymore. It's kind of being backed down as they've lost the temple. They're not as high standing in society anymore. Their membership is small, whereas Christianity is exploding. And so Rome is now very much aware of the growing Christian population and focusing on them. Several apologists are going to become very prevalent in this time. You mainly need to know what we're going to talk about is Justin Martyr. Again, like I said, we're going to be flying at 20, 30,000 feet. And we want to focus more on the big name, that's Justin. I'm going to reference this several times throughout as we talk about second century church. This book, Christianity at the Crossroads. I got this a couple of years ago. This is Michael Kruger. Fantastic. He is covering a lot of what we're going to be talking about here. Love this guy. It's a little more academic. It is still popular. I got that a couple of years ago. Helped me understand church history a little bit more when I was starting to get interested. He's going to talk about some of those apologists. If you want to go into that, it is awesome. He will definitely help you with your understanding of that. Just kind of another note, the apologist. So there's the letter to Irenaeus. It's a famous apology in the 2nd century. And it's, again, you can already tell this language of making known the sweet exchange of that one's sin is being replaced with Christ's righteousness. And so we can already see language that's sounding like 2 Corinthians, 5:21, and different things like that, that we are making known of, that they are trying to persuade others to Christianity. Justin Martyr, who we're going to talk about in a little bit, is one of those people because he's a pagan at the beginning of this, and he is a philosopher, and he actually is going to come to Christ. So without further ado, let's get going because we've got several just teachers that I want to focus on. So we covered persecution already. We've covered the rise of apologetics, and now we're going to see the rise of teachers of these apologetics, and these apologists are going to be teaching us different things. So I'm going to get a drink of lemonade because that is the power and drink of champions. All right, Justin Martyr. So he will be killed, obviously. That is why we have attached. He is a martyr. Justin, right there, his little, there's a picture kind of what he would look like. So he is born in Palestine. He will go to Greece. This is where he's going to learn several different philosophies. He's going to sit under the teaching of the Stoics. He will follow the teachings of Aristotle for a while, Pythagoras, and Plato. Platoism is going to become that kind of branching again of what we talked about of Plato a long time ago in our first lessons. Why I mentioned him was his forms of that there's being something solid and true, and that this perfect thing that's unchangeable was helping lay the groundwork for people to go, it's Christ. And so he is what is actually true and unchanging. And so when we think of a virtue like love, he is the actual definition of that. God is love. And so he's definitely going to expand this field. He's going to be one of our first ones who obviously was, very well versed in philosophy. He is going to become a Christian. There's actually an account of his conversion where he is at the seaside, he's at the shore, and then he has a conversation with an elderly gentleman, and it's going to talk about how he became a Christian, and that the man just displays this massive amount of wisdom, and points him to what Justin will call the true philosophy. He's going to see that one of these great arguments is the logos, is that this is the Christ, this is the word, this is reason. Remember that definition of reason. This is what philosophers are looking for. Reason and understanding that this was God's very true word and wisdom and reason that became flesh and dwelt among us. Justin's pretty good, but he's going to leave it about there. There's still no big works of systematic type theology of kind of getting our thoughts together, getting these different things, kind of more hammered down. But we've got several teachers, so I kind of want to keep going, be mindful of time. Polycarp of Smyrna. So this is going to be, he is also a disciple of John the Apostle. I think we talked about this. Actually mentioned that, yeah. So two other church fathers are going to confirm this and record that Polycarp did sit under the teachings of John the Apostle. He is considered one of the big three. So we talked about the other big two of the apostolic fathers last time, Clement of Rome and Ignatius of Antioch. We don't have too much that's known about Polycarp. Smyrna is near the area of Constantinople, what will be Constantinople, modern-day Istanbul, in Turkey. But what we do know particularly is his death, which is captured in the book, The Martyrdom of Polycarp. He was written a letter by Ignatius of Antioch. And so definitely scholars think that seeing Ignatius and his faithfulness at his death was part of what also captured Polycarp's imagination. So Polycarp was received that letter from Ignatius about 40 years before his death. And so what we're going to see is that he is an older man. The authorities are begging for him to recant. They kind of feel awkward too about this of, you are older, consider your life. You don't have to go through with this. But here's his famous quote that is captured at his death before he's burned at the stake. For 86 years I have served him, and he has done me no wrong. How can I blaspheme my king who has saved me? That again leads to that question of Christ died for us. So we're called to surrender our lives and everything I do. So today, one of the things that I, face is denying myself and taking up my cross, and that may eventually require me to surrender my life for Christ, and that he has died for me. I love that. I've served him and he's done me no wrong. I can't blaspheme my king. He's saved me through his death. And so definitely at this time, martyrdom, death is the death of some of these church teachers is a huge sign and an attribute to, Christianity, how it's moving. Tertullian, who we're going to talk about in just a second, is going to say that that's the seed for the church, is the blood of the martyrs, that it is moving and that it is going forward. Of what speaks to its realness, what speaks to its power, of its trueness, is the fact that people are dying for Christ, that they cannot deny him, that they must live for him through all things. So Polycarp is burned at the stake. He will also mentor. I didn't put this in here. I'm adding different things, so definitely make sure to pause if you're taking notes and add more of what I'm saying. I always hated in school where the person just read through the PowerPoint and didn't add anything. I'm like, I need some dialogue. So here's some dialogue. Irenaeus, who we're going to talk about in just a second. He's a stud of a church father. Love his works and stuff. He is mentored by Polycarp. And so Irenaeus is going to definitely preach this of why he's kind of going to get on his thoughts on bishops, and what we'll see here in just a second is by this passing down of the faithfulness of the word and stuff. And there's a good way to take that, and there is a not so good way to take that, and we'll kind of get into that in a little bit. But here's Polycarp, again, another one of the big ones. So Irenaeus of Lyons, sorry, I don't think there's an S on there, it's just Lyon, of the French saying of that. So it's not lions, it's Lyon. I have to make sure I'm saying that right with my mom. So she knows, she's gone to French. She's practiced French for a long time. So if she sees this, I am so sorry. I will be better. I promise. Anyway, so Irenaeus, he is going to die right at the end of, sorry, not right at the end. He's going to die at the start of the 3rd century. So 202. So Irenaeus, what I love about him is also he's got this more of a pastoral side. When you start to read some of his stuff, he's not as much of this intellectual mindset. He's not into the philosophical style of Justin Martyr or Clement of Alexandria, who we're going to talk about in a second. He's very much more, hey, I am amongst the people. I am a teacher. I preach. And so he's definitely got this when you read some of his selected works, but at the same time, he is an intellectual powerhouse. When you read some of his books and works, Against Heresy is his most famous, and he's going to shred the Gnostics. And we're going to save what Gnosticism is for next week. It's going to be a heresy. The good thing is why I wanted to teach you these teachers now is so when we mention them next week and some of the actions that they're doing, your understanding of a little more who they are, what they believe, what they did. And so I feel like this is kind of the best way to let the cookie crumble, if you will. All right, so he is writing with a pastoral mindset. He is a huge influence in shaping the Bible, the canon in particular. He's going to be one of our big ones. Again, we're going to talk about that also next week. But this guy is vastly important in the recognition of the canon. He's going to be kind of that first one forming of we need the organization of the canon to refute the false teachers. That the Gnostics are going to have a lot of false writings coming up during this time. One of the ones that I've read before, you may have too, is the Gospel according to Thomas is a false gospel. It is a false teaching. A lot of these are coming up around this time, and so what he's saying is we need to gather the books of the Bible together. We need to gather up this canon and have it so that way we can refute and answer, and it can be closed off. He'll also kind of expand different ways in exegesis and theology. So he's going to kind of be a big powerhouse on this. He's talking about orthodoxy here. Love this. Obviously, as Protestants, in particular, this is a Sunday school for hardened Baptist. I know that there's Protestant denominations with bishops and stuff, but from a Baptist perspective, from a division of a church that is organized and governed congregationally, we're going to have to talk a little bit later about some of this. But what he's talking about right now is church leaders should draw their authority from teaching doctrines that have been handed down to them by the apostles. And so Dr. Wright at Southern we'll talk about his argument against when we get to the apostolic succession, which is that the headship of Christ is being passed down to the Pope, and that the Pope is going to become this big, important office. Right now, it's not. Dr. Wright contends that the Catholic Church misinterpreted Irenaeus, and what he is talking about is the faithful handing down of testimonies and having church leaders who have been charged with knowing the teachings of the apostles from the Bible, and that they are to stand against heresy. Canon, he's going to argue the church should make sure that its Bible is completed with 2 testaments. One will be written by the prophets, that is the Old Testament, that canon is closed, it's been handed down, and then the New Testament, which is by the apostles, those who have seen Christ, those who have interviewed those who have seen Christ. So like Luke is one who is interviewing and asking those who have seen the Lord versus another one of Paul, who is an apostle of Christ. Christ appeared to him on the road to Damascus. And so he has been confirmed by the leaders and said, yes, go to the Gentiles, teach. So Irenaeus is just arguing that, hey, the Bible should have two of these, and they should be written by two important offices that are talked about already in Scripture. My guy is blocking the word John, but I'm going to move myself up here because I want you to be able to see all this. And in creeds, he's going to argue for the need for understanding of interpretation. And this is going to come by apostolic teachings and creeds. So apostolic teaching is, hey, Polycarp learned from John the Apostle. I've heard it. And so Dr. Wright kind of uses this more as what we would call evangelism and discipleship making. The fact of, hey, I'm making disciples and I'm passing down what I know of the good news. And that this is more of what he's talking about than the apostolic succession, which we'll talk about. And then the creeds. There's what's called the rule of faith that's already happening here. We'll talk about that again next week because we want to get through these teachers. The rule of faith is going to be important, which is going to lead to the Apostles' Creed of who is Jesus? Who do we say he is? Remember, a lot of people can't read during this time, and so the teaching is through creeds, different things like that of kind of later church uses catechisms to teach its believers. Next up, Clement of Alexandria. Sorry, more champion water. All right. Clement, he's going to die also in the 3rd century, but most of his work happens in the 2nd century, so it's kind of hard to, nobody's going to abide by the centuries in that sense. We're going to have some overlap, so we'll kind of follow through this. Clement of Alexandria, remember this little part up here. He is intellectual. He loves philosophy. He's in Alexandria, which is that kind of powerhouse place of an intellectual movement, philosophy. They love Plato there. This is, again, where the Old Testament was translated into the Greek, the Septuagint, and so this is a very big place for intellectuals and people who are moving about in that kind of community. He is going to argue for a close relationship between faith and reason. Now, remember, Justin Martyr is going to teach that, hey, philosophy points me to the truth. Using the term logos points me to that which is Christ. Of these teachings, this truth that they're hitting on, they don't know, is actually found in the person of Christ. Clement is going to blur the line a little bit more. He's going to put forth that philosophy was a thing given to the Greeks, just like the law was given to the Jews, and it's making God known. I can see in one sense how he's arguing that, maybe from a common grace perspective of just like we've all been common grace of, I look up at the night sky. All right, Psalm 19, the heavens declare his handiwork and different things like that. If we're doing that, I can make sense. I haven't read enough of him to know how he's going, but I know that we're blurring the line because his best known disciple, Origen, is really going to blur these lines. And so when we read Origen, we're going to see how different things come up of a lot of misunderstandings, and there's going to be some quotes from Origen, who we'll study next week. He's born at about 185 AD. Most of his life is into the 3rd century. He's only 15 at the turn of the 3rd century, or turn to the 3rd century. So we're not going to talk about him today, but Origen, we're going to have some quotes that are going to lead to Arius and Arianism and these false beliefs. And so we definitely can see this already beginning here, mainly through this next point of an allegorical approach to hermeneutics. So hermeneutics is just how to read and interpret the Bible. And so he's going to be having these very big allegories of approaches, especially in the Old Testament. We'll talk more about how those look, but he's going to get very interested. It sometimes just sounds ridiculous at times. We're going to, see that from a lot of teachers who prefer this allegory. And Yeah, especially in our understanding and our hermeneutical uh, approaches of 21st century of, in America, in Southern Baptist denomination. So just remember, he is going to kind of favor that philosophy, battle of faith and reason. And he's going to kind of point to more of, hey, um, Christianity can also point to philosophy. And we need to look at where the end is. Justin, the end is pointing to Jesus. Clement, we kind of get a little muddled of sometimes, are we using this to point to Jesus, or are we using it to point to philosophy? Obviously, one is not that. Oh, I'm blocking Tertullian. Let me move myself again. All right, here's Tertullian. So this is going to be our last teacher. We're kind of winding down here. Tertullian, he is born 170 AD. He's going to kind of be what we call the father of Latin Christianity. He is a lawyer by training, and he's going to argue against persecution. Remember that letter from Trajan? He is going to go off on that, very much of using legal arguments against it. He's going to argue that heretics have no right to the scriptures. The church owns the scriptures, and so that they have a say over the interpretation. He is a firecracker of an arguer, if you will. He is very good with his words. He's also going to have several famous quotes. We already talked about his one of the blood of the martyrs is the seed of the church, that it's growing, that the life given up by these disciples is proving faithful, and it's actually bringing more people to the church. He does not care for philosophy at all. So we're kind of flipping back and forth of Irenaeus didn't favor it, but he, didn't go against it. Tertullian is going to fire off of, what does Athens have to do with Jerusalem? What is the academy, which is, the teaching, the place of the teaching of philosophy in Athens, of what does that have to do with the church? He is going to fire off on this of that there's no need for it. Anything that talks about truth outside of the scripture is not worth pursuing. He's going to very adamantly argue this, keep this going. He's going to definitely be a huge kind of wrecking ball a little bit for this, but he's also going to be joining a group that eventually will be known as declared as heretics of the Montanist movement, and we're going to talk about them a little more later again in the heresies. But this is why I want you to know who Tertullian is and what happens to him. When we argue that, you already know, like, oh, okay, so he's the guy who sees more of its scripture over, obviously everything, which we should view it that way. But he's going to write off of philosophy. You don't need to go down that path. Against Praxeas is going to be one of his most famous works, and this is going to start coining that formula of the divinity of Christ, the personhood of Christ, that Christ is one person, but two natures. He's going to be two natures, one divine and one human. And so he's already starting the formula that is going to be used as we wrestle through the Trinity in the 4th century. So when 300s come around, and you've got Arius spouting off, and then you've got Alexander of Alexandria and his, successor Athanasius, and the Cappadocian fathers are going to use this as kind of a kickstart, a jumping off, if you will, of who Jesus is and describing him in the correct way. So Tertullian is a huge, important part of that. Oh, that's the last of my slides. I know I was about to say, making sure I've covered here enough. I hope this has kind of been helpful to you. It's a little more scattered than last week, I feel, but at the same time, we want to make sure that, hey, we are slowly going through this. Last week, I feel like I threw too much information at you. This week, I just want it to be, okay, here's what you need to know. Persecution is still happening, but it's not widespread. Next, we have the rise of apologists, because persecution is not as widespread and is not as violent over all of the empire. It's in different parts. It's localized. Then we finally get to the teachers, that these guys, so that when we get to next week of heresies and different things, that we can really wrestle with who they are and what they believe.
Hey, sorry to interrupt. I know you're busy. Henry and Finley had some questions about.
Hey guys, I had some people who've been mentioning about having some more teachers. So I guess apparently we have some teachers.
So, well, Henry thinks that Antiochus is the better church father. Meanwhile, Finley is really convinced that Clement of Alexandria is. So I don't really know.
Guys, this is Henry and Finley and Hannah, my awesome wife. Yeah, Dada's right there. Apparently, Tertullian looks like Dada. Dada has I have a turban.
You get a turban.
Yeah. So they're going to help me more and more. I know definitely people have been asking for this, but here are my kiddos. I hope you have enjoyed this. I pray that this is beneficial, and we will see you next week. Thanks. Bye. Can you say bye, guys?